Hey everyone, it's Zeffy and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, we're finally doing a team building sort of basic guide, more geared towards endgame content and how I would set up for stuff like Velvet Room trials, SOS, as well as guild battles. But this can also apply to almost every other battle in the game, including your Mementos grind as well as some of your Palaces bosses as well. Now, I won't be going into too much detail about sort of the best teams, just because not everyone's going to be having all the units. I know a lot of people are getting unlucky with their pulls, and to be honest, I don't even have many of the units. Well, actually, I'm just missing Riddle after all this time. But later, when there's more support units, more universal support units coming to global, then I'll be making a team building guide on that with the best teams as well. But if you want to see that video anyway, then definitely don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment down below as well. Liking and subscribing definitely helps the channel out a bunch. Thank you so much for all the support. 11.4 or 3k subscribers I think I saw recently, so that's absolutely amazing. And also don't forget to join the Gacha Rebels, link in the description. So the first thing I want to touch on is basically Wonder and how Wonder works in, like, I guess in this game, because there's a lot of sort of stuff that the game doesn't really tell you. So firstly, obviously the one thing is that Wonder's personas and Wonder's stats, actually I should say, are based purely upon his personas. So the three personas that you can equip on Wonder at the moment, I've got Liana Sheed, Norn, and Saravasti. Obviously, you know, just as a demonstration. Those three personas combined will actually be Wonder's stats combined. So that means it's important that you always keep up with your personas and your persona fusion, because if you are doing level 60, 70 content and, you know, for example, and then you only have like level 30, 40 personas, then you're really only going to be at the level of 30, 40. It doesn't really matter what schema points you have, because, you know, you'll just be at that low level. The other thing that not many people actually realize, and a lot of people ask me in the live streams and stuff, is that Wonder Speed is actually based on the first persona that it's equipped based into battle. So essentially, Wonder's speed, so whoever's in this first slot down here, so as at the moment it is Liana Sheed, the speed of Wonder will be based on Liana Sheed. So if you are playing a supportive Wonder role, as you can see here, I kind of am with Norn, defensively and shielding with Saravasti as well, then you obviously want your speed to be higher than your DPS units. So as long as you go first before your DPS units, then you can set your DPS units up with buffs, etc, etc. That's pretty much all that's really important. I will go through a little bit about speed tuning towards the end of the video as well, so definitely stay tuned. And also, I just want to touch on that as well. In my personal opinion, and especially when you get into the late game, Wonder is 100% the best role for Wonder is a support role. Wonder DPS can work, but there are limited personas in the game that actually make Wonder DPS work. You kind of need to pivot your schema points into mostly all the attack, crit rate, and crit damage. I have definitely seen it work. I've seen people do it multiple times, especially if they're missing particular units. But at the end of the day, there's more supportive personas towards the end, or towards the late game, and also towards, you know, the other regions and catching up on patches, etc, etc. So Wonder is definitely more used for a supportive role, and I always tend to use Wonder in that role as well. And the reason for this is just because his general coverage and his general team building and flexibility is just much higher. You can really use Wonder as your main support, and then you can sub in a debuffer unit or a buffing unit as well. You can use them as a sustain, for example, and that way it gives you more flexibility in the three characters that you actually can choose. Now, the next thing I want to go over is elemental weaknesses. So as you can see, in most combat scenarios in this game, it's all really about elemental weaknesses, and especially in your guild battles, for example. I'll just show this off quickly. Especially in your guild battles, you can see here that they are weak to a certain element, and you get more score if you hit that weakness of that element. Now, this also applies to pretty much everything in the game. You know, when you hit weaknesses in the overworld, as well as Mementos and, you know, challenge runs and stuff like that. Sorry, palace runs and stuff like that. You can down the enemy, and then you can do an all-out attack, which is a almighty attack. Basically, it just does a lot of damage, goes through resist, null, and all those resistances, because it is almighty. Basically, you just want to be able to hit these weaknesses, and that's why it's important to build your teams mostly around these weaknesses. Now, caveat with that is that it's not always this case, because I know a lot of situations where if you just have a fully built team, for example, especially, for example, like even this team right now with Arn and Key, if these units are fully built, they can pretty much get high scores and, you know, rather high scores in SOS, in guild battles, etc, etc. So it's not always the case, but for the most part, you definitely want to be hitting these elemental weaknesses. So just a very quick example about, you know, building up your teams and to hit elemental weaknesses. On side 2, it's Dominion on guild battles, and basically you just want your curse units, right? So for example, I just go in, have a look at what units I have. I go, cool, I have Joker, And of course, I have Best Girl Rin. And now I have a pretty well-built team around it. I've got a buffing unit, I've got Joker DPS, and I've got Yaoling as a sort of like a sub DPS slash debuffer. And then I go into my personas and I go, you know what are the cursed personas I have? Cool, I've got Pale Rider, and then I'll maybe have some supportive roles and maybe a sustain unit. And that's pretty much how I would set up a team, for example. That's very, very basic, but that's how you would sort of go about at least looking at the elemental weaknesses. Now, the next thing is basically just team basics and team building basics overall. So the teams usually consist of 1 DPS unit and 1 support unit. And then obviously your third unit is quite flexible. You can add in a sustain in there. If you don't need a sustain, you can always add in a secondary support unit. And your support units are basically going to be your buffing roles, example Leon here, or your debuffing roles, example Rin here as well. Now, if you don't have a specific unit, for example, if you don't have Joker, then obviously you can substitute Wonder in as your main DPS role, because there's not really any other cursed DPSs. It's probably not the best example, but for example, you don't have Jonkler, then you basically go in and you sub in Wonder as your main DPS, and then obviously you'll spec Wonder into main DPS, and then you can free up the third slot essentially for another support unit, or potentially a sustain unit if you're not going to use supportive Wonder, for example. But if you do have Joker, or you do have a good main DPS on element, for example, then obviously when Wonder can be substituted in as a sustain or not, you can always minus the sustain unit if you don't really need the sustain because Wonder's good enough, and you can sub in another support role as I mentioned earlier. So obviously when you do build teams, in my personal opinion, it really depends on the element first. I usually build teams around the element of the game, and if I don't have the element or I don't have a good unit specifically for that element, specifically talking about main DPS, then I'll basically use Joker as a substitute. This is why I usually advocate for getting a broad range of characters. You don't have to necessarily build all the characters, but at least having the character that you can potentially build in the future for potential content is much better than having dupes in most cases. Obviously, don't get me wrong, I understand that dupes are very, very good as well, but that's why I sort of advocate for that. So then if you do have units or you do have on element stuff that you really, really want to clear, example, Velvet Trials is a perfect example. There's some areas like the Ice and Nuke, trial especially. It's always good to just have one of those units, Ice or Nuke. Well, I guess Queen's really only the Nuke DPS, in order to just be able to clear that content. You don't have to build them like now, or few weeks from now. You can build them right into the future, right? But it's always good to have more units on your account, because eventually guild battles will actually become 3, and you need 3 different teams to take on guild battles. And then you just need, overall you'll need like 9-ish characters to be able to take on those battles. Another example of this is in the companion runs at Adavaka this week on first side. Basically, it's an electric element, and not many people probably have pulled for Yui or will want to pull for Yui. So if you don't have the units, I'll stress again, you can always use Wonder as a substitute. Yalinga on basically, the Rainbow Snake is a good substitute as well. And then obviously some people actually might even have 4 at this stage if they're reaching Wonder level 70 is also a good substitute as well. Now, the next thing is basically just personas in general and how you really set up personas. It's essentially what you want Wonder to do. So if one is in a more supportive role, then obviously you choose more supportive personas. So for example, you choose a sustain, possibly you would choose a buffing unit or a shielding unit like Norn. Or if you're using Wonder as more of a supportive like debuffing role, then you can choose stuff like Cert. Cert's Marakunda is really, really good. And then stuff like Pale Rider as well, with a few curse effects and debuffing effects as well, is really good. But the key thing to remember is that Wonder is very, very flexible. And he can be very good in most of these roles, but do remember that even though Wonder is very flexible and can actually be a supplemental to your team a lot, other units are just generally going to be better. So other units that are like debuffing units specifically or buffing units specifically are just generally going to be better in all senses. So I do highly recommend that you kind of use Wonder as a supplement rather than making Wonder as your main person, because the other units in the game are probably going to be doing Wonder's role a little bit better. So again, more units is better. Wonder is always, in my opinion, used as a supplement, used as supplemental support, especially if, for example, you want to run a sustainless team. As long as Wonder can sustain you up for those, longer fights or those endgame fights, for example, then you can really substitute. You can really just go sustainless in general and then just substitute you know, one of your sustain units for a support unit or a debuffing unit. And also just a quick tip as well, make sure when you do your personas and persona fusions, make sure they're high enough level them up, and then make sure you get their dupes as well so you can level up their instincts, because someone like Norn, for example, at max instinct is absolutely insane. The amount of defense and shielding that Norn actually gives is just incredible. So make sure you're keeping up with your Velvet Room and keeping up with your persona fusions and stuff like that. Now, the next thing I want to touch on is basically NAVIS. Now, NAVIS are super important. You always want to build your NAVIS. And the main reason why you want to build your NAVIS is because of your enhanced status. All NAVIS have these, and I believe 5-star NAVIS actually increase it to about 20%. And it basically means you get additional stats based on a percentage of the NAVIS stats. So if your NAVIS is low level, then you get lower additional stats. If your NAVIS are higher level, you get higher additional stats. So I know a lot of questions come in and they go like, oh, why do I keep dying in this content, or like what's going on? Like why is my team so weak? It could possibly be because you haven't built your NAVIS, you haven't leveled up your NAVIS weapon enough, and you're not getting the raw stats of your Navi in order to be able to transfer into your team. So it is very important that you build NAVIS. Now, as soon as sort of more Navi units come out, obviously we have 2 at the moment, NAVIS can literally make or break fights, and they can literally carry you through most difficult fights in the game. So for example, like Futaba, for example, with her weakness implant, it's absolutely insane. And the amount of times where, like, you know, Futaba will be able to, shred a resistance, for example, or get rid of a null, for example, it just becomes absolutely like just incredible. You can build more flexible teams around her, so you don't actually have to necessarily be on element, because Futaba can actually, basically implant weaknesses. So all I'm trying to say is NAVIS are really good. You definitely want to build your NAVIS, and then you also 100% want to level up your Navi skills. So for example, with Puppet, you definitely want to level up skill 1 and skill 3 because they just give incredible shielding. And then Okian, for example, skill 1 as well, which gives you a really good attack value as well. Now, I do get a lot of questions about speed and speed tuning in general. Now, if you are coming from games like HSR, for example, speed tuning, like in that game, is a completely different beast. There's a lot of different things that you can do because of the action values, because of your turn cycles, and all that sort of stuff. So I just want to explain a little bit how it works in this game. So how speed in this game works, it essentially just determines the order that your characters move. That's pretty much it. You don't get extra turns in a cycle. You don't get additional turn, you don't get additional action value, you don't get additional score or anything like that. All it does is determine the turn order. And it also determines how frequently your characters actually dodge attacks. So obviously you can speed tune to the point where, you can do a lot more dodges. It's like Sugakaja, for example, and basically evasion. You can think of it as an evasion. But mostly you just want to, speed tune, as I mentioned before, to your point where your supports are moving before your DPS, so you can set up your DPS units. Again, personally, I wouldn't worry too much about getting the speediest characters. They kind of just need to have a higher value than DPS, and that's really all that matters. But obviously units like Rin, for example, who scales off speed, you obviously want high speed on Rin, but you want high speed on Rin anyway because Rin is a debuffing unit, so you want to make sure you debuff the enemies before your, Junkler or any other unit comes in and does massive damage. Alright, the last thing I want to quickly touch on is basically revelation cards in team building, essentially. So again, like revelation cards, I've gone over this in the video, but essentially if you are dying a lot, I do recommend just throwing on a recommended set or throwing on some cards to at least get some set effects and some additional stats. But the thing with revelation cards that's important that you want is basically you want the additional effects that come with the revelation card set. So what I mean by this, and this helps in team building as well, is that after attacking a foe increases party's damage by 8% for 1 turn, for example. And essentially that is a team-wide buff. So there's a lot of these units that actually do have team-wide buffs on their, recommended revelation card sets, for example. So for example, with Leon, at the start of battle, increases other allies' attack by 10%. So you basically just want to look for these effects. Usually these are the recommended sets anyway, so you will be getting these effects if you combine them with the correct space cards. So all you want to try and make sure is that you just have a really good set that can power up the team as well. There's not really any specifics in terms of rev cards and stuff like that. I wouldn't necessarily build rev cards where you have like group ride buffs on all the characters, for example. Like obviously your DPS units, you probably want to just focus on increasing their damage. For example, with Joker, this is not the best set, but for example, two set Ruin increases coast damage by 10%. There's no group buffs here, but it just buffs Joker's damage in general. So that's sort of like an additional tidbit to your main team building. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. So basically, you know, just tips, I guess, and summary of everything. You want at least one main DPS, one support, and one sustain unit. You can't drop the sustain unit if Wonder is being, you know, whatever flexible role Wonder has. Wonder is very flexible, which makes team building in this game very flexible. You can build a whole range of different team comps. Eventually, you know, you will get some units that are best in the slot. For example, Joker's best in slot is definitely Rin. But that's how it basically works. You just want to see what element the boss or the end game content is. You want to build around that element in order to get the highest score possible. Joker's stats are based on his personas, so therefore level up his personas. Joker's speed is based on the first persona in the first slot equipped, so make sure that at least if you are playing a supportive role, you want to be moving faster than your DPS. If you are playing a main DPS role on Wonder, then you want to make sure that your speed is a little bit less and to make sure that all your other units go before Wonder. Personas are very, very important. You want to keep up with their levels because they dictate Wonder's levels. So in the team fighting, if Wonder is super weak, which I know a lot of people ask as well, then it's probably because you haven't leveled up your persona stats. So just make sure you keep up with your personas in the Velvet Room and hang out with Merope. Build your NAVIS. I can't stress this enough. Building NAVIS is super, super important just because of the additional stats that, you know, you get throughout the party, as well as their amazing abilities, like Puppet, for example, that will most likely keep you alive. And you can pretty much run sustainless comps because Puppet's shield is absolutely insane. Speed and speed tuning. Speed just determines order, really. There's no like additional actions you can do in the cycles and stuff like that. Obviously, that's really like sort of like the minimum level. You can speed tune to a sense where some supports can move before other supports in order to get the optimal setups. But realistically, as long as your supports are moving before your DPS, you're pretty good to go. And lastly, just overall in terms of optimizations for teams, it's just building rev cards and making sure that you get really good team-wide buffing effects, especially for your support units, for example, like what I showed with Leon's cards, where you get a team-wide 10% attack increase when you enter battle. And that way you can optimize your teams a little bit more to do a little bit more damage to eke out a little bit more score in the in-game content. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the video. It is a little bit of a longer video, but I just wanted to explain some of the mechanics around team building and get you guys to think about sort of on the element, what DPS units you want to build, how you want to build Wonder in the future as well. But if you do have any other questions, definitely leave a comment down below. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe on the video. It definitely helps out the channel a much. So thanks for watching, everyone. I really appreciate everyone's time, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.
Ready to